The horizon did not offer a line of hope, only a jagged wall of gray water that seemed to lift the wooden hull of the HMS Wager toward a sky heavy with low-hanging clouds. It was May 1741, and the vessel was trapped in the southeastern Pacific, stripped of its mainmast, and pushed relentlessly toward an uncharted, splintered coastline. On board, the sounds of survival had narrowed down to the screech of overstrained timbers and the raspy breathing of men dying from scurvy. Their gums were black, their teeth loose, and their joints so swollen that moving a single sail felt like lifting an iron anchor. Captain David Cheap stood on the quarterdeck, his hands frozen to the rail, staring into the mist where the spray of breaking waves warned of hidden reefs. He was a man consumed by duty and a desperate need to prove his worth, having only recently taken command after the previous captain died during the passage around Cape Horn. This expedition, led by Commodore George Anson, was supposed to harass Spanish shipping and capture a legendary treasure galleon. But the Wager was no longer a weapon of war. It was a floating hospital, a splintering shell filled with weakened soldiers, exhausted sailors, and a growing sense of doom that no naval discipline could suppress. The sea did not hit the ship all at once, but rather tore at it in successive, calculated blows. A rogue wave lifted the stern and dropped it directly onto a submerged rock with a sickening crunch that vibrated through the boots of every man below deck. Water rushed into the hold, instantly drowning the few men too sick to crawl out of their hammocks. The impact threw Captain Cheap across the deck, dislocating his shoulder and leaving him agonizing on the wet planks while the crew panicked. In those chaotic minutes, the rigid hierarchy of the Royal Navy began to dissolve. Men who had spent months under the lash of discipline broke into the spirit room, knocking the heads off brandy casks to drown their terror before the ocean could drown them. Others fell to their knees in prayer, while a few gathered whatever weapons they could find, recognizing that once the ship was lost, the laws that governed them might wash away too. When the hull finally wedged itself between two massive rocks a few hundred yards from a desolate shore, the survivors scrambled into the ship's boats or swam through the freezing surf. They dragged themselves onto a landscape of rocks, boggy mud, and dense, dripping rainforest that would come to be known as Wager Island. Out of the nearly 300 men who had left England, only about 140 made it to the beach alive. They were soaked to the bone, shivering violently in the biting Patagonian autumn, with no shelter and only the few provisions they could salvage from the wreckage before it sank entirely. The land offered no comfort. It was a labyrinth of cold mountains, relentless rain, and wind that never stopped howling from the west. As the first night fell, the survivors huddled under improvised tents made from torn sails, listening to the roar of the surf and realizing they were marooned thousands of miles from civilization, with no way to call for help. From the very beginning, the camp was divided by an invisible line of authority that grew thinner by the day. According to British maritime law at the time, when a ship was wrecked, the crew's wages stopped immediately, and with the loss of pay, many argued that the captain's legal authority vanished as well. John Bulkley, the ship's gunner, was a pragmatic, highly intelligent man who possessed a deep understanding of navigation and a natural ability to lead men who felt abandoned by their officers. Bulkley looked at the barren rocks and knew that staying on the island meant a slow death by starvation. He believed the only chance for survival was to repair the ship's longboat, lengthen it, and sail south back through the Strait of Magellan to reach the coast of Brazil. Captain Cheap, however, flatly refused this plan. His obsession with his mission remained unbroken despite the disaster. He wanted to go north, using small boats to raid Spanish settlements along the Chilean coast, capture a Spanish vessel, and somehow rejoin Commodore Anson's squadron. To Bulkley and the majority of the crew, Cheap's plan was a suicide mission that prioritized military glory over human life. The tension under the wet canvas tents escalated as food supplies dwindled to almost nothing. The daily ration became a meager handful of flour mixed with water, supplemented by whatever seaweed, limpets, or wild celery the men could scrape off the rocks. The hunger was a physical weight, slowing their movements and sharpening their tempers. Rumors began to circulate through the mud-soaked camp that some men were secretly caching food, while others whispered about darker methods of survival in the woods. When a midshipman named Henry Cousins became unruly after drinking smuggled liquor, he engaged in a loud, abusive argument with the ship's purser and eventually confronted the captain himself. Cheap, already stressed to the point of madness by his injury, his lost command, and the murmurs of mutiny, did not hesitate. He stepped out of his tent and shot Cousins in the face. The bullet tore through the young man's cheek, but Cheap refused to allow the surgeon to treat him. Cousins lay dying in the mud for days in full view of the camp, a gruesome testament to the captain's unyielding, brutal determination to maintain control. Instead of cowing the crew, the death of Cousins solidified their resolve against the captain. John Bulkley saw the shooting as definitive proof that Cheap was unfit to lead and had crossed the line into tyranny. Working secretly with John Cummins, the ship's carpenter, and a large faction of the crew, Bulkley began the arduous task of transforming the longboat into a 30-ton schooner they named the Speedwell. They sawed the vessel in half, added 11 feet to its middle, and raised its sides to withstand the monstrous seas of the Southern Ocean. Every hammer blow against the iron nails was a step closer to open rebellion. John Byron, a young midshipman who would later become a grandfather to the famous poet, found himself caught between his loyalty to the naval uniform and his basic instinct to live. He watched the camp fracture into armed camps, knowing that a single spark would ignite a civil war on the rocks. By October, 5 months after the wreck, the longboat was ready, and the final confrontation could no longer be avoided. Bulkley and his followers presented the captain with a document signed by the majority of the crew, demanding they sail south. When Cheap stubbornly insisted on his plan to go north, the men took action. They surrounded the captain's tent, burst inside, and pinioned his arms behind his back while he lay in bed. They accused him of the murder of Henry Cousins and declared him under arrest to face a court-martial in England. However, Bulkley had no intention of dragging a hostile, bitter captain through thousands of miles of treacherous seas. In a calculated compromise, they left Cheap behind on the island, along with the loyal ship's surgeon and Lieutenant Alexander Campbell. At the last minute, John Byron and a few others, torn by conscience, decided to step out of the mutineers' boat and remain on the beach with their marooned commander, choosing the uncertain loyalty of the wild coast over the treasonous journey south. The departure of the Speedwell left a profound, echoing silence on Wager Island. Captain Cheap, Byron, Campbell, and a handful of loyalists were left with only a small barge and a yawl, completely inadequate for the open ocean. Their numbers were small, their bodies emaciated, and their food supplies virtually non-existent. Cheap's initial anger hardened into a grim, unyielding focus on moving north. They set out into the labyrinth of Chilean fjords, a landscape of towering granite cliffs, glaciers that advanced into the sea, and narrow channels where the wind shifted violently without warning. Every mile was a battle against hypothermia and exhaustion. The men rowed until their hands bled and their muscles seized, only to find themselves pushed back by fierce headwinds that kept them trapped in secluded coves for days at a time. The journey north quickly degenerated into a nightmare of endurance that tested the absolute limits of human will. During one particularly brutal storm, the yawl capsized, drowning several men and destroying a large portion of their remaining equipment. The survivors were forced to abandon some of their companions on a barren rock because the remaining barge could not carry them all. The screams of the abandoned men, fading into the sound of the wind, haunted Byron for the rest of his days. To survive, the remaining group resorted to eating their own leather shoes, boiling beaver skins they found in abandoned native camps, and chewing on rotten seal blubber. Cheap's health deteriorated rapidly. His legs swelled with edema, and his mind occasionally wandered, yet he remained fiercely, almost terrifyingly fixated on reaching a Spanish settlement, preferring the certainty of a foreign prison to the slow erasure of the wilderness. Their salvation arrived not through their own navigation, but in the form of the indigenous Kano people who inhabited the archipelago. A local chieftain named Martin agreed to guide the remaining survivors toward the northern settlements in exchange for the iron fittings from their abandoned barge. The Kano possessed an intimate, ancestral knowledge of the waterways, navigating their canoes through hidden passages and finding food where the British sailors saw only wet rock and deadwood. They taught the Europeans how to gather nutritious roots and dive for shellfish in the freezing waters. Under the guidance of Martin, the small group finally crossed the formidable Taitao Peninsula, a notorious geographic barrier where they had to haul their heavy wooden boats across miles of swampy land and dense jungle to reach the safer waters of the Chiloé archipelago. By the time Captain Cheap, John Byron, and Alexander Campbell reached the Spanish outpost on Chiloé Island in 1742, they were unrecognizable as British naval officers. They were clothed in tattered skins, covered in sores, and so emaciated that their bones seemed ready to puncture their skin. The Spanish authorities, recognizing them as enemy combatants but moved by their wretched condition, treated them with a mixture of suspicion and humanity. They were placed under house arrest and eventually transferred to the larger colonial center of Santiago, where they spent several years waiting for an opportunity to be exchanged or paroled. In the colonial capital, the young Byron managed to charm the local society with his manners. While Cheap remained distant and brooding, his thoughts undoubtedly focused on the men who had mutinied against him and the reckoning that awaited them all back in London. Meanwhile, the story of John Bulkeley and the mutineers on the Speedwell was a separate epic of desperate navigation and staggering loss. After leaving Wager Island, they had plunged into the Strait of Magellan, facing waves that rose like mountains and winds that threatened to flip their modified vessel at any moment. The crowded deck was a scene of constant misery. Men died of exposure and starvation almost daily, their bodies cast over the side without ceremony. Out of the nearly 80 men who had sailed away from Cheap, only a fraction survived the passage into the Atlantic. They drifted up the coast of Argentina, living on penguins and sea lion meat, before a remnant of the crew finally reached safety in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, in January 1742. From there, Bulkeley and a few core survivors managed to secure passage on merchant ships returning to Europe, desperate to tell their side of the story before the captain could return to brand them as traitors. When Bulkeley arrived in England in 1743, he did not wait to be arrested. He immediately published a detailed journal of the voyage, presenting himself and his men not as mutineers, but as rational, desperate survivors who had overthrown a murderous captain to save their own lives. The book became a sensation in London, capturing the public's imagination and creating a wave of sympathy for the crew. For a time, it seemed that Bulkeley had successfully controlled the narrative, but the legal reality of the Royal Navy was far more rigid than public opinion. The Admiralty could not easily overlook the deposition and abandonment of a commissioned captain, as it struck at the very core of naval discipline and the authority of the Crown on the high seas. The entire situation exploded in the public eye when Captain David Cheap finally landed on English soil in 1746, accompanied by John Byron. Cheap's return was like a ghost appearing to demand vengeance. He immediately leveled charges of mutiny, treason, and desertion against Bulkeley and the surviving crew members. The Admiralty was forced to convene a formal court-martial aboard the HMS Prince of Orange to investigate the loss of the wager and the actions that followed. The trial became a legal battleground that fascinated the nation, pitting the traditional, unyielding rights of command against the fundamental human right to survive when command has clearly failed. During the proceedings, the room was filled with tension as the survivors faced each other across the courtroom. Bulkeley argued fiercely that because the wager had been destroyed and their wages stopped, the strict articles of war no longer bound them in the way the prosecution claimed. He painted Cheap as a tyrant whose obsession had cost lives and whose shooting of Henry Cousins was an act of cold-blooded murder. Cheap, conversely, stood on his dignity as an officer, maintaining that his authority was permanent and that the crew's refusal to follow his plan to go north was an act of open rebellion that justified any measure necessary to suppress it. The midshipman John Byron provided crucial, measured testimony that confirmed the hardships they had faced but avoided taking a radical stance against either side, balancing his loyalty to the service with the undeniable truth of their suffering. In the end, the Admiralty delivered a verdict that surprised many but reflected a pragmatic desire to put the embarrassing and legally complicated affair to rest. The court-martial focused primarily on the loss of the ship itself, rather than the muddy legalities of the mutiny on the island. Captain Cheap was acquitted of misconduct regarding the wreck, and his harsh measures were largely excused under the exigencies of command, though his reputation was permanently tarnished by the shooting of Cousins. Remarkably, Bulkeley and the mutineers escaped the gallows. The court utilized a legal loophole, deciding not to try them for mutiny under the Articles of War, because the events had occurred after the ship was lost and pay had ceased, effectively treating the incident as a breakdown of civil order rather than a military uprising. The legacy of the Wager mutiny lingered long after the survivors left the courtroom. The narrative of the wreck, detailed in competing memoirs by Bulkeley, Byron, and Campbell, became a foundational text for British maritime culture, influencing writers like Patrick O'Brian and providing a sobering counterpoint to the triumphalist myths of imperial expansion. It revealed the fragile nature of civilization when stripped of its institutional frameworks, showing how quickly the thin veneer of discipline can be stripped away by hunger, cold, and the terrifying expanse of an indifferent ocean. The moss-covered rocks of Wager Island remained silent, a distant graveyard for the men who had died in the mud, while the survivors carried the psychological scars of their ordeal for the rest of their lives, bound forever by the memory of a dark beach where the law of the sea had truly broken down.